The silence of the Kang estate was never peaceful. It was heavy, weighted by the secrets of the man who owned it. Mina had worked there for 6 months, moving like a ghost through the marble corridors, always keeping her eyes downward. Kang Dae-hyun was a name whispered with terror in the streets of Seoul, a man of sharp edges and a gaze that felt like a blade against the skin. To the rest of the world, he was a predator. To Mina, he was a fever dream she couldn't shake. She found herself drawn to his private study and bedroom more often than her duties required. It was the only place that smelled of him: sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and something metallic that reminded her of danger. On a humid Tuesday afternoon, while the rest of the staff was occupied in the lower kitchens, Mina found herself in his sleeping quarters. The heavy curtains were drawn, casting the room in a deep amber twilight. She was supposed to be changing the linens, but the sight of his unmade bed, the sheets still bearing the scent of his skin, made her knees weak. She sat on the edge of the mattress, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Slowly, she laid back, sinking into the silk pillows that had held his head just hours before. Closing her eyes, she conjured the image of him, the way his pulse jumped in his neck when he was angry, the strength in his hands when he gripped a glass of whiskey. Her hand moved of its own accord, sliding beneath the hem of her uniform. The friction of the fabric against her skin was a poor substitute for what she truly wanted, but her imagination filled the gaps. She whispered his name into the empty room, a breathless plea that broke the silence. Her movements became more urgent, her breathing shallow and ragged as she envisioned his heavy weight pressing her into the mattress, his dark eyes finally looking at her, not as a servant, but as a woman. The click of the door's electronic lock was a sound she didn't hear over the rush of blood in her ears. Dae-hyun stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh light of the hallway. He didn't move, and he didn't speak. He watched as the girl he had barely noticed for months arched her back, her face flushed with a desperate, lonely passion. It wasn't until she gasped his name one final time that he stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind him with finality. Mina froze. Her eyes snapped open, landing on the tall, imposing figure standing at the foot of the bed. Terror, cold and sharp, flooded her veins, replacing the warmth of a moment ago. She scrambled to sit up, her hands trembling as she tried to smooth her hair, her face burning with a shame so intense she felt she might lose consciousness. I'm so sorry, sir. I'll leave. I'll go," she stammered, her voice cracking. She tried to rush past him, but Dae-hyun's hand shot out, catching her by the arm. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. He didn't look angry. Instead, his dark eyes were burning with a predatory curiosity that made her breath hitch for an entirely different reason. "You were calling for me," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to hum through her entire body. "And now that I'm here, you're running away?" I didn't mean for you to see," she whispered, unable to look away from him. Dae-hyun stepped closer, forcing her back against the mahogany bedpost. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip, which was still trembling. "The things you were doing, Mina, the things you were saying, do you have any idea what happens to people who touch what belongs to me without permission?" Mina shook her head, her heart racing. "Kill me then," she breathed, a spark of defiance meeting his gaze. "Because I can't stop thinking about it." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Dae-hyun's face. It was the first time she had ever seen him look truly human, and yet he looked more like a devil than ever. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. "I have a better idea. From this moment on, you don't do anything alone. You want me? You have me, but you have to handle everything that comes with it." He didn't give her a chance to respond. He crashed his lips against hers, a kiss that tasted of possession and suppressed fire. It wasn't the gentle kiss of a lover, it was the claim of a king. Mina wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, surrendering herself to the chaos she had just invited into her life. The maid was gone. In her place stood a woman who had just stepped into the center of a storm. The air in the bedroom grew thick, the heat between them shifting from a panicked spark to a steady consuming flame. Dae-hyun didn't pull away. Instead, he backed her onto the bed again, but this time his weight followed hers. The transition from the girl who scrubbed his floors to the woman who held his neck was instantaneous. He looked down at her, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of regret or fear, but he found only a reflected hunger. His hands, seasoned by violence and power, were surprisingly steady as they moved over her. He made no effort to hide his intentions, and she made no effort to hide her surrender. The encounter was a blur of heavy breathing and whispered admissions. When he finally took her, it wasn't with the coldness of a transaction, but with a desperate, grounding intensity. It was as if he were finding something he hadn't known he was missing, and she was finally touching the sun she had watched from the shadows. In that hour, the hierarchy of the house crumbled, replaced by a raw, carnal bond that bound them together before the sweat had even cooled on their skin. Dae-hyun sat up eventually, reaching for a cigarette on the nightstand, but his other hand remained firmly draped over Minna's waist, pulling her into his side. He didn't tell her to get dressed and return to her quarters. He didn't dismiss her with a cold nod. Instead, he watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling and spoke as if they had been partners for years. "There is a meeting in an hour," he said, his voice returning to that low, authoritative rumble. "The heads of the Busan families are coming here to discuss the shipping routes. They expect to see me alone, surrounded by men with guns." Minna looked up at him, her heart still racing from their shared intimacy. She waited for the instruction to hide, to disappear back into the kitchen where she belonged. "You're going to sit beside me," he continued, turning his head to look her directly in the eye. "From this moment, you don't leave my side. If I'm eating, you're eating. If I'm bleeding, you're the one who cleans the wound. You wanted me, Minna. This is what I am. You don't get to pick and choose the parts you like." The weight of his words was heavier than his body had been. He was offering her a seat at a table made of glass and bone. Minna didn't hesitate. She sat up, her hand resting over his heart, feeling the steady thrum of his life force. "I didn't want a piece of you," she replied softly. "I wanted all of it." Dae-hyun stood, reaching down to pull her up with him. He didn't let her go to her own room to gather her things. He led her into his vast walk-in closet and then toward the private bathroom, where the steam soon filled the air. They bathed together, the water washing away the remnants of her old life. He handled her with a possessive care, his fingers tracing the curve of her spine as if marking his territory. When they emerged, the atmosphere of the house had shifted. As they walked down the grand staircase toward the dining hall where his lieutenants waited, the silence of the guards was deafening. They looked at Minna, then at the way Dae-hyun's hand was locked firmly in hers, and they quickly lowered their heads. There was no explanation given, and none was asked for. They entered the high-ceilinged room where 3 men in expensive suits sat, their faces etched with the hardness of the underworld. They started to rise to greet their boss, but froze when they saw the girl. One of the men, a scarred elder named Director Park, cleared his throat, his eyes darting to Minna. "Dae-hyun, we have matters of extreme discretion to discuss," Park muttered, gesturing vaguely toward her. "Perhaps the help should." Dae-hyun pulled out the heavy velvet chair at the head of the table and forced Minna to sit in it. He didn't take his own seat until she was settled. He leaned back, his arm draped over the back of her chair, his fingers idly playing with a strand of her hair. "She isn't the help," he said, his voice dropping an octave, sending a chill through the room. "She is the only person in this room I trust. If I have something to say to me, you say it to both of us. If that's a problem, you can leave your territories at the door on your way out."
The men exchanged glances of sheer disbelief, but the look in Dae-hyun's eyes promised a violent end to any protest. For the next 2 hours, Minna sat in the den of wolves. She listened to talk of shipments, bribes, and the elimination of rivals. She felt the tension in Dae-hyun's body, the way he calculated every move like a grandmaster on the chessboard. Underneath the table, his hand found hers, squeezing tightly whenever the conversation turned particularly dark. She wasn't just a witness, she was his anchor, and as she looked around at the men who feared him, she realized she was no longer afraid. She was the shadow to his flame, and the world was about to find out how dangerous they were together.
The meeting ended with a heavy silence as the Busan directors filed out, their faces pale and their steps hurried. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut, the mask of the cold syndicate leader didn't fully drop, but it softened at the edges. Dae-hyun turned his chair toward Minna, his gaze scanning her face for any sign of cracking. He expected to see terror or confusion, but all he saw was a quiet, focused intensity. He stood up and reached for her hand, pulling her to her feet. Instead of leading her back to the safety of the bedroom, he walked her toward the heart of the house, the kitchens. It was the hour when the staff usually gathered for their evening meal, a time of gossip and shared fatigue. As the double doors swung open, the clatter of silverware and the hum of voices stopped instantly. Mrs. O, the head housekeeper who had managed the estate for 20 years, stood frozen with a ladle in her hand. Her eyes darted from Dae-hyun's stoic face to Minna, who was still wearing her simple uniform but carried herself with a new, quiet dignity. The sight of their intertwined fingers caused a ripple of visible shock to pass through the room. "Minna is no longer on the roster," Dae-hyun announced, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. There was no room for negotiation in his tone. "She will not be cleaning, she will not be serving, and she will not be sleeping in the staff wing. From now on, she is to be treated as you treat me. If she asks for something, it is as if I am asking for it." He didn't wait for a response. He walked to the center island, took a clean plate, and began to serve food for her himself. The act was so domestic, so utterly contrary to the image of the man who had just threatened to dismantle a shipping empire, that the staff could only stare in a daze. He handed the plate to Minna and watched her eat, his eyes never leaving her. "You haven't eaten all day," he remarked, his voice dropping to a private whisper. "From now on, we eat together. I don't care how busy the day is." Later that night, the house was submerged in a restless sleep, but in Dae-hyun's study, the lights were still burning. He sat at his desk, surrounded by monitors showing various docks and warehouses across the city. Minna was curled in the large leather armchair beside him, a book in her lap that she wasn't actually reading. She was watching him. She watched the way his jaw tightened as he read a report, and the way he habitually rubbed a faded scar on his forearm. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. Dae-hyun looked over, his eyes weary. "Only when it rains, an old gift from a rival who didn't live long enough to see it heal." He beckoned her over. Minna stood and walked to him, standing between his knees as he sat in his swivel chair. She took his arm, her fingers light and cool against the jagged line of the scar. She leaned down and pressed a lingering, gentle kiss to the mark. The gesture was so tender it seemed to startle him. He gripped her waist, pulling her flush against him, his face burying into the crook of her neck. He took a long, shaky breath, inhaling the scent of her that was now mixing with the sandalwood of his own soap. "Everyone wants something from me, Minna. My money, my territory, my head on a plate. Why did you look at me the way you did this afternoon? Why weren't you afraid?" "Because I've seen you when you think no one is looking," she whispered, her hands sliding into his dark hair. "I saw you feed the stray cats behind the garage. I saw you stand in the rain for an hour after your father's memorial service. The man they fear is a mask. The man I want is the one who's tired of wearing it." Dae-hyun's grip tightened. He stood up, lifting her effortlessly so her legs wrapped around his waist. He walked her to the large windows that overlooked the glowing skyline of Seoul. He pressed her against the cool glass, his mouth finding hers in a slow, deep exploration.
It wasn't the frantic heat of their first encounter. It was something more profound, a wordless promise of protection. He began to trail kisses down her throat, his hands sliding beneath the fabric of her dress, tracing the curve of her hips with a deliberate rhythm. Minna arched into him, her head falling back against the window. The contrast of the cold glass and his burning skin made her gasp. He moved with a deliberate slowness, making her feel every inch of his strength, ensuring she knew exactly who she belonged to. In the dim light of the study, surrounded by the machinery of his dark empire, they found a strange, beautiful peace. He didn't just want her body, he wanted her presence to fill the hollow spaces of his life. As the city lights twinkled below them, the Mafia Boss and the Maid were no longer roles they played. They were simply two souls entwined, preparing for a world that would undoubtedly try to tear them apart.
The sun had barely begun to bleed over the horizon when Dae-hyun woke. For the first time in years, he didn't reach for the handgun on his nightstand the moment his eyes opened. Instead, he felt the rhythmic breathing of the woman curled against his side. Mina was still deep in sleep, her hand resting on his chest as if to ensure he was still there. He stayed still for a long time, watching the way the early light caught the soft lines of her face. The realization that he now had a vulnerability was clear, but strangely, it didn't feel like a weakness. It felt like a reason. When she finally stirred, he didn't give her time to feel the morning after awkwardness. He pulled her closer, his lips finding the crown of her head. "Today is going to be long," he murmured against her skin. "I have to visit the docks. There's a shipment coming in that's being contested by a rival faction. You're coming with me." Mina sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She didn't ask if it was safe, she simply nodded. "Then I should get ready." They left the estate in a convoy of 3 black SUVs. Dae-hyun sat in the back of the middle vehicle, his hand locked with Mina's. Sitting across from them was Sang-woo, Dae-hyun's right-hand man and childhood friend. Sang-woo's expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the window, though the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. He had watched Dae-hyun kill men without blinking, but seeing him hold a girl's hand with such protective ferocity was a new kind of danger. "The Jochis are moving in on Pier 47, Sang-woo reported, his voice clipped. "They think because of the recent internal restructuring we're distracted. They don't know about the change in arrangements." He glanced briefly at Mina, then back to his boss. "Let them think I'm distracted," Dae-hyun said, his thumb idling over Mina's knuckles. "It makes them sloppy." When they arrived at the docks, the air was thick with the smell of salt and diesel. Dozens of men in dark suits stood gathered near a cluster of shipping containers. As Dae-hyun stepped out of the car, he reached back to pull Mina out with him. He didn't hide her, he kept her tucked under his arm, his presence a shield. The men bowed low, a wave of dark fabric dipping in unison. The confusion among the lower ranks was palpable, but the fear of Dae-hyun's temper kept every mouth shut. They climbed the stairs to a small glass-walled office overlooking the pier. Inside, a man was tied to a chair, his face bruised and his breathing heavy. He was a scout for the rival family, caught trying to sabotage the cranes. Dae-hyun didn't release Mina's hand. He led her right up to the man. The scout looked up, his eyes widening as he saw the boss, and then flickering with a confused sneer at Mina. "Is this your new toy, Kang? You've gone soft bringing a girl to a graveyard." Dae-hyun's expression didn't change, but the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He let go of Mina's hand only to reach for a heavy glass paperweight on the desk. He didn't strike the man, he simply set it down with a deliberate thud. "She isn't a toy," Dae-hyun said softly. He looked at Mina. "He thinks you make me weak. What do you think?" Mina looked at the man in the chair. She remembered the nights she had spent cleaning the bloodstains out of Dae-hyun's shirts, wondering what kind of monsters he had to face to come home looking so haunted. She stepped forward, leaning down until she was eye level with the captive. "A man who has nothing to lose is just a ghost. A man who has everything to lose is a god. You should be much more afraid than you were 5 minutes ago." Dae-hyun's eyes flared with a dark, proud fire.
He stepped behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. He leaned in, whispering so only she and the terrified scout heard. "You see, she understands me better than any of you." He signaled for Sang-woo to take the man away. As the room cleared, Dae-hyun turned Mina around to face him. He lifted her onto the edge of the desk, his hands sliding up her thighs. The adrenaline of the confrontation was still humming between them. He kissed her with a sudden, desperate hunger, his tongue tasting the defiance he had just heard in her voice. "You're dangerous," he breathed against her lips, his hands tightening her. "I'm yours," she corrected, her fingers digging into his shoulders. In the middle of a war zone, surrounded by enemies and the stench of the underworld, they found a moment of frantic, searing heat. He pressed her back against the desk, the maps and ledgers scattering to the floor, replaced by the weight of their bodies and the intensity of a bond that was becoming the most powerful weapon in Seoul.
The drive back from the docks was silent, but the air inside the car had changed. The tension was no longer about the business they had just conducted, but about the gravity of the choice they had made. Dae-hyun kept his arm around Mina, his fingers tracing patterns on her skin as he stared out at the passing neon lights of the city. He was a man who lived by calculations, and for the first time in his life, the math didn't add up. By bringing her into the light, he had made her a target, yet the thought of sending her back to the shadows was unbearable. When they arrived back at the estate, the gates swung open with their usual mechanical precision. Inside, the house was quiet, but Mina could feel the eyes of the hidden security guards following them. Dae-hyun didn't lead her to the dining room or the study. He took her straight to the private gallery at the back of the house, a room filled with ancient pottery and cold stone statues. He stopped in front of a painting, a stark, monochromatic landscape of a winter forest. "My father told me that a man in our position can only love things that don't breathe," he said, his voice echoing against the high ceilings. "Art, gold, land. Because things that breathe can be taken away, they can be hurt." Mina stepped closer to him, her shoulder brushing his. "And did he love anything that breathed?" "Only power," Dae-hyun replied, turning to look at her. "And look where it got him. He died in a room full of gold, completely alone. I don't want that. But I'm realizing that keeping you close means I'm inviting you into the firing line." Mina reached up, her palm resting against his cheek. The stubble of his beard prickled her skin, a grounding sensation. "I was already alone in this house, Dae-hyun. I was a ghost cleaning up after a man who didn't know I existed. I'd rather be a target by your side than a ghost in your hallway." The honesty in her voice seemed to strip away the last of his professional armor. He pulled her into a sudden, fierce embrace, his face buried in her hair. They stayed like that for a long time, two people trying to build a fortress out of nothing but their own bodies. Later that evening, as they shared a quiet meal in his private quarters, a soft knock came at the door. Sang-woo entered, his face grim. He held a small, black velvet box. "This was left at the front gate, boss. No note, just this." Dae-hyun set his wine glass down, his eyes turning to flint. He opened the box. Inside was a single silver earring, one that Mina recognized instantly. It was a cheap, simple stud she had lost a week ago while gardening. The message was clear. Someone had been close enough to touch her things. Someone was watching the maid who had suddenly become a queen. Dae-hyun's hand clenched around the box until his knuckles turned white. He didn't explode in anger. He became unnervingly still. He looked at Sang-woo. "Double the perimeter. Check the CCTV from the last 48 hours. I want to know who stepped foot within a mile of these gates." Sang-woo bowed and disappeared. The room felt colder now. Mina stared at the earring, a symbol of her previous life now turned into a threat. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but before it could take hold, Dae-hyun was there, lifting her from her chair. "Look at me," he commanded. When she met his gaze, she saw a terrifying level of devotion. "They think they can use you to get to me. They think you're my weakness.
We're going to show them that you're the reason I'm going to burn their world down." He carried her to the bed, the urgency between them shifting into something protective and deep. He moved with a slow, deliberate possessiveness, his hands exploring her body as if he were memorizing every curve, every secret. The intimacy tonight wasn't just about desire. It was an act of defiance against the world outside their door. As they lay together in the aftermath, the moonlight filtering through the curtains, Dae-hyun didn't sleep. He watched the door, his hand resting protectively over hers. He had spent his life building an empire of fear, but as he looked at the woman beside him, he realized he was finally building something worth fighting for. The war was coming, but for the first time, he wasn't fighting for land or pride. He was fighting for home. The following morning, the estate felt less like a home and more like a fortress under siege. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the silent, vibrating tension of men preparing for a storm. Dae-hyun didn't leave for his office. Instead, he took Mina to the sub-basement, a part of the house she had never seen. It was a sterile, soundproofed space filled with the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of a private shooting range and a gym that smelled of sweat and cold iron. He stood behind her, his chest pressed to her back, his arms reaching around to guide her hands as she held a sleek, heavy handgun. He didn't treat her like a porcelain doll. He treated her like a soldier. His voice was a low, steady anchor in her ear, explaining the mechanics of the weapon, the weight of the trigger, and the necessity of the follow-through. "If I am not there, you are the last line of defense," he whispered, his breath warm against her cheek. "I don't want you to be a victim of my life. I want you to be the master of it." Mina felt the kick of the weapon vibrate through her bones as she fired. It was terrifying, but with Dae-hyun's hands over hers, it was also exhilarating. She realized then that he wasn't trying to change her. He was trying to give her the tools to survive the world she had chosen. Every time she hit the target, he pressed a small, firm kiss to the side of her neck, a silent reward that made her heart race faster than the gunfire. They spent hours in that basement, the physical toll of the training drawing them closer. When they finally stopped, she was trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Dae-hyun led her to a bench, picking up a towel to wipe the smudge of gunpowder from her thumb. He looked at her with an intensity that made her feel more seen than any words ever could. "You're a fast learner," he remarked, his eyes dark with a mixture of pride and something hungrier. "I have a good reason to be," she replied, reaching out to trace the line of his jaw. "I'm not losing this. I'm not losing you." He pulled her into his lap, his hands sliding up her thighs with a possessive heat. The sterile, cold environment of the gym faded away as he kissed her, a deep, thirsty collision of lips and tongues. He moved with a sense of urgency, his fingers tangling in her hair as he pushed her back against the padded weight bench. The contrast of the hard, industrial setting and the soft, desperate curve of her body beneath him ignited a fire that they couldn't extinguish. It was a brief, intense union, a way to reclaim their bodies from the fear that the morning's threat had brought. Later, as they returned to the main house, the atmosphere shifted again. Sang-woo met them in the hallway, his face a mask of professional gravity. He held a tablet showing a grainy image from a hidden camera near the perimeter fence. It showed a figure in a delivery uniform, but the way the man moved, efficient, shadowed, and deliberate, suggested he was no courier. "It's the Han syndicate," Sang-woo said quietly. "They're testing the fences. They know she's here, and they know what she means to you." Dae-hyun's face hardened into a mask of lethal intent. He looked at Mina, then back to the screen. "They think they can play with my head. They think they found a crack in the armor." He turned to Sang-woo. "Call a meeting of the inner circle, tonight. We aren't going to wait for them to come to us. We're going to burn their foundations while they're still dreaming of ours." Mina stood by his side, her hand resting on the small of his back. She could feel the shift in him, the transition from the lover who had just held her to the man who commanded legions of shadows. She didn't shrink away. As the lieutenants began to arrive at the house, she stood at the top of the stairs with him, watching the players of the underworld gather. Dae-hyun didn't introduce her as his maid, or even as his girlfriend. He simply kept his hand on her shoulder, a silent declaration of her status. During the meeting, he sat her in the chair directly to his right. He spoke of strategy, of logistics, and of blood, and occasionally he would pause to look at her, as if checking to see if she was still with him. She was more than with him. She was observing the men in the room, noticing the way one of the younger lieutenants kept glancing at his phone, his eyes darting nervously toward the windows. She leaned in, whispering into Dae-hyun's ear as the discussion raged about the Han docks. "The one on the far left," she murmured. "He's not listening to you. He's waiting for something." Dae-hyun didn't react immediately. He finished his sentence, then slowly turned his head to look at the man Mina had pointed out. The air in the room vanished. The silence became a physical weight. Dae-hyun's eyes narrowed, a predatory glint appearing in his gaze. He realized then that Mina's years of being a ghost in his house gave her a gift he hadn't considered. She knew how to watch people when they thought they were invisible. The maid who had once polished the floors was now the only one who could see the dust on his empire.
The room was so still that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Dae-hyun didn't pull his gaze away from the young lieutenant, whose name was Ji-hoon. Mina sat perfectly still, her hand still resting on the table, her pulse steady despite the lethal atmosphere she had just ignited. She watched as Ji-hoon's hand twitched toward his pocket, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Ji-hoon," Dae-hyun said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Mina tells me you aren't focused. Is there something on your phone more important than the survival of this family?" The young man stammered, his eyes darting toward the exit. "No, boss, I was just checking the perimeter reports." Dae-hyun stood up slowly. He didn't reach for a weapon. He walked around the table, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He stopped behind Ji-hoon, placing a hand on the back of his chair. The other men in the room held their breath. With a lightning-fast movement, Dae-hyun reached into Ji-hoon's pocket and pulled out the phone. He glanced at the screen and his jaw tightened. "The Han Syndicate," Dae-hyun murmured, showing the screen to the room. It was a live location map of the estate. "You were giving them the coordinates for the security blind spots." Before the traitor could even plead, Sang-woo was on him, dragging him from the chair. The room erupted into a brief, controlled chaos as the other lieutenants rose, their loyalty reinforced by the immediate consequences of betrayal. Dae-hyun didn't follow them out. He stayed in the room, looking at the empty seat where the traitor had been, and then he looked at Mina. He walked back to her, his expression a mixture of awe and grim realization. He took her hands in his, pulling her up so she stood in the center of his power. "You saved us tonight," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "I have spent years looking for enemies in the dark, and I missed the one right in front of me. How did you know?" "People think I'm part of the furniture," she said softly. "They forget that the furniture hears everything." He was breathing too fast, Dae-hyun. He was waiting for the world to end. Dae-hyun let out a short, dark laugh. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel the frantic beat of his heart. The weight of his world was immense, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't carrying it alone. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "I told you that you have to handle everything that comes with me. I didn't realize you'd be the one handling it better than I do." They left the war room and retreated to his private sanctuary. The adrenaline of the betrayal was still humming in the air, a restless energy that needed to be spent. As soon as the door clicked shut, the silence of the room was broken by the sound of their combined breathing. Dae-hyun didn't go to his desk or the window. He went straight for her. He backed her against the door, his hands framing her face. The kiss was desperate, flavored by the high stakes of the night. He moved with a feverish intensity, his fingers fumbling with the fastenings of her clothes, as if he needed to be as close to her as humanly possible to prove they were both still alive.
Mina responded with equal fervor, her hands sliding beneath his shirt, feeling the heat and the hard muscle of his back. He lifted her, her legs locking around his waist as he carried her toward the bed. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Every touch was an admission of how much they had come to rely on each other in just a few short days. He laid her down, his body a heavy, protective warmth above hers. The intimacy was tender, but marked by a raw, hungry edge. As they moved together, the world outside, the traitors, the rival syndicates, the flickering monitors ceased to exist. There was only the friction of skin, the shared breath, and the absolute certainty that they belonged together. In the quiet aftermath, they lay tangled in the sheets. Dae-hyun traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, his eyes soft in the dim light. "They're going to come for us now," he whispered. "The Hans know their man inside is gone. They'll be desperate." "Let them come," Mina replied, her voice sleepy but firm. She shifted, resting her head on his shoulder. "They think they're fighting a tiger. They don't know he has someone watching his back." Dae-hyun let out a short, dark laugh. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel the frantic beat of his heart. The weight of his world was immense, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't carrying it alone. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "I told you that you have to handle everything that comes with me. I didn't realize you'd be the one handling it better than I do."
The night didn't break with a bang. It broke with a whisper of glass shattering in the far wing of the estate. Dae-hyun was awake before the sound had even faded, his hand already gripping the pistol from the nightstand. Beside him, Min-ah bolted upright, her eyes wide but her hands steady. There was no time for explanations. The Han syndicate hadn't waited for the sun. They had moved through the shadows of the garden, bypassing the outer sensors that Ji-hyun had compromised before his removal. "Stay behind me," Dae-hyun commanded, his voice a low, lethal rasp. He didn't wait for her to agree. He pulled her into the reinforced dressing room, a space with no windows and a steel-lined door. "Stay here. Do not open this for anyone but me or Sang-woo." "No," Min-ah said, her voice cutting through the rising panic of the sirens now echoing through the house. She reached into the bedside drawer where he had placed a secondary weapon for her. "You taught me how to use this. You said I was the last line of defense. If they get past you, I'm not waiting in a box to be found." Dae-hyun looked at her, his heart warring with his instincts. He wanted to lock her away, to keep her pristine and untouched by the filth of his world. But he saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had drawn him to her in the first place. He realized that hiding her would be an insult to the woman she had become. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of her strength, and handed her an extra magazine. They moved through the darkened hallway, the air smelling of gunpowder and expensive floor wax. Muffled shouts and the rhythmic pop-pop of suppressed gunfire erupted from the grand staircase. Dae-hyun moved like a shadow, his movements economical and deadly. He took out 2 intruders near the landing with a precision that was terrifying to behold. As they reached the gallery, a third man lunged from behind a marble pillar, his blade reflecting the moonlight. Dae-hyun engaged him in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle. Min-ah saw a second man leveling a rifle at Dae-hyun's back from the balcony above. She didn't scream, she didn't freeze. She raised her weapon, remembering the weight of his hands over hers in the basement. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil jolted her arm, but the man on the balcony fell, his rifle clattering onto the marble floor. Dae-hyun finished his opponent and turned, his eyes wide as he looked from the fallen assassin to Min-ah. He didn't say a word, but the look of raw, unfiltered devotion he gave her was more powerful than any declaration of love. He grabbed her hand, and they sprinted toward the security hub, where Sang-woo was already coordinating the counterstrike. The battle was short and violent. The Han hit squad had expected a distracted boss and a terrified Maid. They hadn't expected a unified front. By the time the sun began to rise, the estate was silent again, though the scars of the night were everywhere.
They retreated to the master bedroom, the only room that felt like it still belonged to them. Dae-hyun closed the door and leaned his forehead against it, his shoulders shaking from the come-down of the adrenaline. Min-ah approached him, reaching out to touch his arm. She noticed a thin red line on his cheek where the blade had grazed him. The sight of his blood broke her composure. She let out a jagged breath, her hands trembling as she reached for his face. "You're hurt," she whispered. Dae-hyun turned, catching her hands. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the smudge of soot on her forehead and the fierce loyalty in her gaze. "I'm fine," he said, his voice thick. "But you saved my life, Min-ah. You were never supposed to have to do that." He pulled her into him, his kiss tasting of salt and survival. It was a desperate, grounding connection. He needed to feel the life in her, to erase the image of the rifle pointed at his back. He lifted her, carrying her to the bed that had seen their transition from strangers to soulmates. The intimacy that followed was different from the others. It was slower, more reverent. He touched her as if she were made of glass, his hands tracing every inch of her skin with a profound gratitude. He wanted her to feel how much he valued her, not just as a lover, but as his equal. As they moved together in the soft morning light, the hierarchy of the world outside was completely forgotten. There was no boss, no maid, only two people who had looked into the abyss and survived because they were holding onto each other. As they lay in the quiet aftermath, the city waking up below them, Dae-hyun held her close, his chin resting on top of her head. "It's not over," he murmured. "The Hans will pay for this, every single one of them." Min-ah tightened her hold on him. "I know, and I'll be there when they do." Dae-hyun closed his eyes, a small, tired smile touching his lips. He had spent his life building a kingdom of fear, but he realized now that he had finally found his queen.
The cleanup of the estate was handled with the cold efficiency that defined Dae-hyun's organization. By noon, the shattered glass had been replaced, the blood had been scrubbed from the marble, and the bodies had vanished as if they had never existed. But the air remained charged. The failed assassination attempt had acted like a catalyst, stripping away the last remnants of the boss and maid dynamic. They were now something else entirely, a unified front that the rest of the syndicate watched with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Dae-hyun spent the afternoon in his study, but the door was no longer locked. Min-ah was at his side, leaning over a map of the Incheon harbor. She wasn't just observing, she was pointing out the blind spots in the warehouse districts she had grown up near. Her local knowledge was a resource Dae-hyun had never tapped into, and he listened to her with a focused intensity that made the other captains in the room shift uncomfortably. "The Han family uses the old cannery as a secondary checkpoint," Min-ah said, her finger tracing a path along the coastline. "The police patrols skip that block because of the fumes. If you want to hit them where it hurts, you don't go for the main office, you go for the pulse." Dae-hyun looked at her, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He reached out, his hand covering hers on the map. "You hear that?" he asked, looking up at Sang-woo. "The girl you all thought was a distraction just gave us the key to the Han's front door." Sang-woo bowed his head, a newfound respect in his eyes. "I'll prep the teams immediately, boss." As the room cleared, leaving the two of them alone, the weight of the coming war seemed to lift for a moment. Dae-hyun stood up and pulled Min-ah into the space between his knees. He wrapped his arms around her waist, leaning his head against her stomach. It was a gesture of vulnerability he would never show another living soul. "I spent 10 years building this empire so I wouldn't have to depend on anyone, and here I am, unable to breathe if you aren't in the room." Min-ah ran her fingers through his hair, her heart aching with the depth of his admission. "Independence is just another word for being alone, Dae-hyun. You weren't built to be alone." He looked up at her, his dark eyes shimmering with a mix of exhaustion and desire. The adrenaline of the planning session began to shift into a more intimate heat. He stood up, not breaking eye level with her, and led her to the small velvet sofa in the corner of the room. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, orange shadows across the floor. He kissed her with a slow, deliberate sweetness that gradually deepened into something more urgent.
His hands were steady as they explored her, rediscovering the curves he had come to worship. It wasn't about power or possession this time. It was about connection, a way to anchor themselves before the chaos of the final strike. He moved with a rhythmic grace, his body a perfect counterpoint to hers. The sounds they made were soft, lost in the quiet hum of the estate, a private language spoken only by them. The intimacy was a sanctuary, a brief period where the names of families and the stakes of territories didn't matter. In that hour, they weren't a mafia boss and a strategist. They were just two people finding home in each other's arms. When the moon finally rose, casting the room in silver, they remained entangled on the sofa. Dae-hyun held her close, his thumb tracing the line of her shoulder. The peace was temporary, and they both knew it. Tonight, they would move against the Han family. Tonight, the streets of Seoul would know that Dae-hyun was no longer a man with everything to lose, but a man with everything to fight for. "Are you ready?" he whispered into the darkness. Minia sat up, her eyes reflecting the cold light of the moon. She reached for the handgun she had kept nearby, checking the safety with a practiced click. "I've been ready since the day I walked into your room," she said. Dae-hyun stood, reaching out his hand to pull her up. "Then let's go end this."
The rain in Incheon was cold and relentless, a gray curtain that blurred the line between the sky and the sea. Dae-hyun stood at the edge of the pier, the collar of his coat turned up against the wind, his silhouette a sharp blade against the industrial landscape. Behind him, dozens of men moved with lethal silence, but his attention was entirely on the woman standing beside him. Minna didn't look like a girl who had spent her life cleaning floors. She looked like the eye of the storm. The raid on the Han family's cannery was swift and surgical. Using the routes Minna had identified, Dae-hyun's men bypassed the main gates and struck from the water. The sound of gunfire was swallowed by the crashing waves and the roar of the rain. Dae-hyun moved through the warehouse with a focused savagery, clearing the path until they reached the upper office, where the head of the Han syndicate, an older man named Han Jin-ho, sat cowering behind his desk. Dae-hyun didn't shoot him immediately. He stepped aside, allowing Minna to enter the room first. The sight of the Maid standing in the heart of their fallen empire was the ultimate insult to the old man's pride. "You lost your kingdom because you didn't look at the people beneath you," Dae-hyun said, his voice cold and steady. "You thought she was a weakness. You thought she was someone to be used, but she's the one who found you." He didn't need to say more. The message was sent to the entire underworld that night. Dae-hyun was no longer a solitary predator. He had a partner, a mind that matched his own, and a loyalty that couldn't be bought. When they walked out of the smoking ruins of the cannery, the rain washing the soot from their faces, the war was over. The Han family was a memory, and the Kang estate was the undisputed seat of power in Seoul. The drive back was different from any other. The silence wasn't heavy with planning or fear. It was light with the relief of a shared victory. When they reached the estate, the gates opened to a staff that stood in two perfect lines, bowing deeply as the car passed. There was no confusion now, no whispers in the kitchen. They bowed to the boss, and they bowed to the woman who sat beside him. Inside the house, the air felt warmer, the shadows no longer hiding threats, but offering privacy. Dae-hyun led Minna up the grand staircase, but they didn't stop at his study. He took her to his bedroom, the place where it had all begun. He closed the door, locking it with a finality that signaled the world could no longer reach them. He turned to her, his eyes soft and filled with a rare, aching tenderness. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he brushed a damp strand of hair from her face. "It's done," he whispered. "There are no more ghosts in this house." Minna stepped into his space, her hands sliding up his chest to rest against his neck. "There's only us." The kiss that followed was slow, a long-awaited celebration of their survival. The heat between them, which had been a frantic fire during the days of war, had settled into a deep, glowing ember. He moved her toward the bed, the silk sheets a cool contrast to the fever of their skin. Every touch was an exploration of their new reality, no longer forbidden, no longer a secret, but a bond forged in fire.
He moved over her with a deliberate, worshipful slowness, his hands tracing the path of her breathing. The intimacy was a quiet conversation, a promise that he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never felt like a ghost again. As they moved together, the rhythm of their bodies matching the steady rain against the window, the labels of boss and maid were buried forever. In the quiet hours before dawn, Minna lay with her head on Dae-hyun's chest, listening to the steady, calm beat of his heart. The man the world feared was fast asleep, his arm draped protectively over her waist even in his dreams. She looked around the room, the sanctuary where she had once hidden her desires, and realized it was now her home. She started as the help, cleaning the corners of his life, but she had ended up becoming the center of it. As the first light of a new day began to filter through the curtains, Minna closed her eyes, finally at peace. The monster had found his match, and the maid had found her king, and together they were the masters of their own dark, beautiful world.